It was a cold morning in Copenhagen, the kind of morning that made the air bite against your skin and your breath visible in soft clouds. The sun had only just begun to rise, spreading a faint golden line over the rooftops. Students hurried across the cobblestone paths of the old university courtyard, holding notebooks tight under their arms. Among them walked a quiet young man named Hans. He wasn't the kind of student who stood out in a crowd. His clothes were simple, his shoes worn, his hair slightly messy as if he had been awake all night. But there was something in his eyes, something sharp, alive, curious. Hans had spent the last week in his tiny rented room above a bakery, studying by candlelight for his final physics examination. The sound of the baker's oven below kept him warm at night, but his mind was restless. He loved physics, but not the way it was taught. He didn't see it as a list of rules to memorize. He saw it as a way to understand the world, to ask why when others said because. That was both his strength and his problem. Some professors admired his curiosity. Others thought he was too bold, too unconventional. That morning, as Hans walked toward the examination hall, his heart beat faster than usual. He could hear the chatter of other students, some confident, some terrified. "Did you review the barometer question?" one whispered. "Of course," said another. "They always ask it. It's a classic." Hans smiled faintly. He had read that question too, many times, but something about it always made him laugh quietly to himself. It wasn't hard. It was predictable. Inside the examination room, everything was still. The old wooden desks were polished to a dull shine. At the front sat 3 professors in dark coats, papers stacked neatly in front of them. The lead examiner, Professor Lind, was a man of rigid habits. He believed in rules, precision, and obedience to established methods. To him, a good student was one who followed the book without deviation. He respected discipline, not imagination. Hans entered when his name was called. He greeted the professors politely and stood before them, his hands trembling just enough to betray his nerves. The room smelled faintly of ink and chalk. Professor Lind looked at him over his round spectacles and said in a steady voice, "Young man, we will begin with a simple question." He picked up a piece of paper from the stack and read, aloud, "Explain how you would determine the height of a building using a barometer." Hans felt the corners of his mouth twitch. There it was, the same question everyone had expected. He had read countless versions of the correct answer in textbooks. Measure the air pressure at the top and bottom, calculate the difference, and use the formula that relates pressure to height. That was what every student was supposed to say. But Hans didn't want to repeat what the book said. He wanted to think. For a few seconds, he stood silent, looking down at his hands. Then he looked up and said calmly, "I would take the barometer to the roof of the building, tie it to a long string, and lower it until it touches the ground. Then I would measure the length of the string. That would give me the height of the building." There was a pause. A long, uncomfortable pause. Professor Lind blinked, then frowned. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the other examiners. One of them raised an eyebrow. Another hid a small smile. Lind turned back to Hans. "Repeat that," he said slowly. Hans repeated his answer, word for word, his tone respectful but steady. "I would tie the barometer to a string, lower it from the roof, and measure the string's length." Lind's face hardened. "Are you mocking this examination, Mr. Hans?" "No, sir," Hans replied softly. "I gave you my answer." "That is not the scientific answer," Lind snapped. "We asked for a method based on physics." Hans hesitated. He didn't want to argue, not here, not with 3 professors staring at him. He could have easily recited the standard formula and passed, but something inside him refused to back down. He had always believed that physics wasn't about repeating what others said. It was about understanding the principles behind things, no matter how you approach them. The other examiners exchanged quiet glances. One of them, a younger professor named Henrik, spoke gently. "Technically, his answer is not wrong," he said. "It does measure the height of the building, though perhaps not in the way we intended." Lind ignored him. "We do not need clever tricks here. We need proper understanding. You may sit down." Hans sat, his hands folded in his lap. His mind raced between disappointment and quiet pride. He knew he could have impressed them by saying what they wanted to hear. But he also knew that his answer, while simple, showed real thinking. He had taken a basic question and treated it like a puzzle. That was what science meant to him. Not memorization, but creativity. When the examination ended, Hans walked out of the room into the crisp winter air. His classmates surrounded him almost immediately. "What did they ask you?" one said eagerly. "Was it the barometer question?" Hans nodded. "So what did you say?" someone else asked. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I told them I'd tie the barometer to a string and lower it." There was a burst of laughter. A few students slapped his back, amused. "You're insane," one said between chuckles. "You'll fail for sure." "Maybe," Hans said, still smiling faintly. "But it's still the right answer." Later that evening, Hans sat at his small desk by the window. The city outside was covered in mist, the lamps glowing like faint stars. He replayed the moment in his head again and again, the professor's glare, the silence, the laughter of his friends. Doubt began to creep in. What if he had made a fool of himself? What if he'd thrown away his chance at graduation just to make a point? He sighed and leaned back in his chair. His eyes landed on the old barometer sitting on his shelf, the one he had borrowed from the university lab. It wasn't much, a simple glass tube with a column of mercury inside, but to him it was a symbol. Not of formulas or grades, but of curiosity. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, and whispered, "You're not just for measuring pressure, are you? You're for asking questions." He stayed up late that night thinking about how rigid education had become. Students memorized equations, recited definitions, and called it understanding. But when faced with a real problem, most froze if it didn't fit the pattern. That, he thought, wasn't learning. It was imitation. Days passed before the results were posted. The morning they were announced, the courtyard was crowded. Students pressed around the notice board, reading their scores with trembling hands. Hans stood at the edge of the crowd, too nervous to move closer. He didn't expect much. He just wanted to know if he had passed. Finally, a friend came running through the crowd. "Hans," he called. "You passed." Hans blinked. "What?" "Barely, but you passed. They said the professors couldn't agree on your answer, so they gave you another chance to explain it." A wave of relief washed over him. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. That afternoon, he was called back into the same examination room. Professor Lind looked as stern as ever, but Professor Henrik was smiling faintly. "Mr. Hans," Lind began, "your previous answer was unconventional. We have decided to allow you to justify it." Hans nodded. "Thank you, sir." Lind leaned forward. "Then tell us, how does your method demonstrate understanding of physics?" Hans took a breath. His heart pounded, but his voice was calm. "Sir, physics is not about using one method. It's about applying principles to solve problems. My answer was simple, but it used measurement, a fundamental part of physics. But if you want another answer, I can give you several." The professors looked at each other, intrigued. Hans continued, his confidence growing. "I could also drop the barometer from the roof and time its fall, then use the formula for acceleration due to gravity to calculate the height. Or I could measure the difference in air pressure at the top and bottom and calculate it from that. Or if I wanted to use human reasoning, I could offer the barometer to the building's caretaker in exchange for the actual height." Even Professor Lind couldn't hide a faint smile this time. When Hans left the room again, something had shifted. He didn't just feel like a student anymore. He felt like a thinker. He didn't know it yet. But his small act of defiance, his one-line answer, would soon spark conversations far beyond that university. Conversations about what it really meant to learn. Hans didn't sleep much that night. Even though he had passed, something inside him kept stirring. His mind wouldn't rest. He lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. The silence in the room, the professor's anger, and the strange mix of laughter and admiration from his classmates. It wasn't about the grade anymore. Something deeper had begun. The next morning, the streets were wet from rain. The gray clouds hung low and the air smelled of damp stone and fresh bread. Hans walked toward the university with his hat pulled low. He wasn't sure what kind of looks he'd get from the others. News of his strange exam answer had spread faster than he expected. As he reached the main gate, he heard whispers. A group of students stood near the entrance, talking excitedly. One of them noticed him and grinned. "There he is, the barometer genius." Hans stopped, half embarrassed, half amused. "I'm not a genius," he said quietly. "You made the professors fight over your answer," another student said. "That's genius enough." Hans smiled awkwardly. He didn't like attention, but it was true. His answer had caused a stir. Some professors thought he was disrespectful. Others thought he was brilliant. He didn't plan any of it. He had just spoken what felt right. Later that day, Hans walked through the physics building. He could hear the sound of chalk scraping on blackboards, the murmur of students discussing equations, and the occasional bang of a dropped book. When he passed the lab, Professor Henrik called out to him, "Hans, a moment, please." Hans turned. Henrik was standing by a desk covered in instruments, thermometers, pendulums, and, of course, a barometer. His gray hair looked messier than usual, and his eyes had that curious brightness of someone who loved questions more than answers. "I've been thinking about your exam," Henrik said. "That answer you gave, it wasn't wrong. In fact, it was rather clever." Hans shifted his weight. "I wasn't trying to be clever, sir. I just thought that was one way to measure it." Henrik nodded slowly. "And that's exactly the point. You thought, most students don't do that. They memorize. You, however, thought." Hans looked down at his shoes. Professor Lind didn't seem to like it much. Henrik smiled faintly. "Lind is a man of rules. He believes education is about precision, not imagination. But physics, real physics, requires both. Tell me, Hans, why did you give that answer?" Hans hesitated. "Because everyone already knows the formula. But I wanted to see the problem differently. It's not about showing knowledge, it's about understanding the world. A barometer isn't just a tool. It's something that connects to everything. Air, pressure, height, even human curiosity." Henrik's smile widened. "You remind me of someone I once knew," he said quietly. "He used to say that true science starts where certainty ends." They stood in silence for a while. The ticking of a clock filled the room. "Would you like to help me with a small experiment this week?" Henrik asked finally. "I think you'll find it more exciting than the usual assignments." Hans's eyes lit up. "Of course, sir." That small invitation marked the beginning of something unexpected. Over the next few weeks, Hans spent long hours in the lab with Henrik. They tested new instruments, studied pendulums, and even tried to design a device to measure air resistance more accurately. Henrik encouraged him to question everything: why a ball falls, why air moves, why light bends. Sometimes they'd end up talking late into the evening. Henrik shared stories about great scientists: Galileo, who had been punished for thinking differently; Faraday, who had no formal education, but changed how people understood electricity. One evening, while cleaning glass tubes on the workbench, Henrik said, "Do you know why your answer at the exam mattered, Hans? It wasn't because it was correct. It was because it challenged the way we teach." Hans looked up. "You mean because I didn't repeat what the book said?" "Exactly," Henrik replied. "Education has become a game of remembering. We've forgotten that learning starts with curiosity. When a student asks what if, the world moves forward. When a student only says this is the answer, the world stands still." Hans thought about that long after he left the lab that night. He realized Henrik wasn't just talking about him. He was talking about the whole system, how students were trained to follow, not to explore. A few days later, Professor Lind passed Hans in the hallway. Lind's face was unreadable. For a moment, Hans thought he might ignore him, but then Lind stopped. "Mr. Hans," he said curtly, "I've heard that your little performance in the exam has become quite the topic of discussion." Hans stayed quiet. Lind continued, "Some find it amusing. Others think it's an example of clever disobedience. I, however, see it as misplaced wit." "I didn't mean to disrespect you, sir," Hans said sincerely. "I just thought differently." "Different is not always better," Lind replied coldly. "Remember that." He adjusted his coat and walked away. Hans watched him go, feeling a mix of frustration and pity. He understood now Lind wasn't a bad man. He was a man trapped by his own rules. He had spent his life guarding the gates of tradition, too afraid to open them. That afternoon, when Hans returned to the lab, Henrik was there waiting, holding a letter. "Hans," he said, "your answer has reached the dean's office." Hans froze. "Am I in trouble?" Henrik laughed softly. "Quite the opposite. The dean wants to meet you." The following morning, Hans found himself in a large office lined with tall bookshelves. The dean, an older man with kind eyes, motioned for him to sit. "Mr. Hans," he began, "I've heard about your examination. Your answer has caused some spirited debate among the faculty." Hans nodded nervously. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, sir. The dean smiled. Sometimes trouble is exactly what we need. Tell me, in your own words, why did you give that answer? Hans hesitated, then spoke from his heart. Because physics isn't about following a formula. It's about understanding nature. I could have given the expected answer, but that wouldn't have shown my thinking. I just wanted to show that there are many ways to reach the truth. The dean leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. You know, young man, our university prides itself on tradition. But tradition without growth becomes a cage. You've reminded us that learning should be alive. That's rare. Hans felt a wave of relief. Thank you, sir. As he left the office, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The air outside felt different, brighter somehow. He realized his small act of honesty had started a quiet storm inside the university. People were talking. Professors were debating. Students were thinking differently. That evening, he met Henrik at a small cafe near the university. The place was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and the soft hum of conversation. Henrik raised his cup toward him. To thinking differently, he said. Hans smiled. To asking questions. They both laughed. But as much as Hans wanted to believe it was over, it wasn't. The next few months would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. His answer had not only changed his own path, it had challenged the entire foundation of how physics was taught. And not everyone welcomed change. Rumors began to spread. Some professors accused Henrik of encouraging unorthodox thinking. Others said Hans's behavior set a bad example. Yet quietly, students began experimenting more. They started asking why in classes, not just writing down formulas. The atmosphere was shifting. One afternoon, a first-year student stopped Hans in the hallway. Sir, the boy said shyly, is it true you told the professors you'd measure a building's height with a string? Hans chuckled. Yes, that's true. The boy grinned. That's brilliant. I tried it at home with a ladder. It worked. Hans laughed warmly. That's the spirit. Always try things yourself. Walking home that day, he realized that something far greater than an exam result had begun. His one-line answer had become a spark, a small light that was starting to glow in the minds of others. He looked up at the gray sky, the clouds breaking just enough for sunlight to touch the rooftops. Maybe, he thought, this was what learning was supposed to feel like, not fear, not pressure, but curiosity and joy. Weeks passed, and the story of Hans's exam answer kept echoing through the university halls. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It had become something bigger, a quiet debate about what it truly meant to learn. In lecture rooms, some professors defended tradition. They said rules kept knowledge pure. Others began to question those same rules, wondering if education had become too rigid, too mechanical. And in the middle of it all was Hans, the quiet student whose single line had started it all. At first, Hans didn't know how to handle the attention. Some students admired him, asking for advice, calling him the one who challenged the system. Others rolled their eyes, saying he got lucky and that it was just a stunt. But Hans didn't care about fame. He only wanted to understand things, to explore ideas freely. One rainy afternoon, Hans sat by the large window of the physics library. Drops of rain slid down the glass, distorting the view of the courtyard outside. The smell of old books and ink filled the air. He had been there for hours, lost in thought. He wasn't studying for an exam this time. He was reading out of pure curiosity. Books on light, sound, and the strange experiments of early scientists. As he flipped through a dusty old volume, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Professor Henrik. Still lost in the universe, I see, Henrik said with a kind smile. Hans looked up. I suppose I am, sir. Henrik sat across from him, placing a small notebook on the table. I wanted to show you something. These are my notes from when I was a student. Experiments, mistakes, and questions that no one ever answered. Hans opened the notebook carefully. The pages were filled with scribbles, sketches of pendulums, and odd equations crossed out again and again. In the margins, words like why and what if appeared repeatedly. You see, Henrik said softly, the best scientists never stop asking those questions. The day we stop being curious, we stop learning. Hans nodded, running his fingers over the ink. I wish everyone thought that way. Henrik sighed. Change comes slowly. Many fear it. Your answer in that exam, it challenged their comfort. You didn't insult the system, Hans. You reminded it to breathe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain tapped gently against the glass. Then Henrik leaned forward. "The dean has asked me to prepare a lecture next month on new teaching methods." "I want you to help me." "Me?" Hans said, surprised. "Yes, you see, if we are going to change how physics is taught, it shouldn't come from old professors like me. It should come from a student who dared to think differently." Hans didn't know what to say. A mixture of pride and fear filled his chest. I don't know if I can do that, sir." Henrik smiled. "You already have." That night Hans couldn't sleep again. His thoughts raced as fast as lightning. What if he failed? What if everyone laughed? He wasn't a public speaker. He was just a student who happened to give an unusual answer. But somewhere deep down another voice whispered, "You didn't come this far to be silent now." Days turned into weeks as he and Henrik began working together. They met after classes, sitting at the same lab table where the barometer still rested, its glass shining under the gas lamps. Henrik would talk about how science education had become too focused on rote learning. "We've turned discovery into repetition," he said one evening. "We hand students answers before they've had a chance to wonder about the question." Hans listened carefully. "Maybe if teachers asked open questions, students would explore more." Henrik nodded. "Exactly. We must make them curious again." The two of them began drafting ideas, new experiments, open discussions, and ways to make physics feel alive. They wanted students to build things, to test their own ideas, to fail and learn from it. But not everyone was happy. Word of their collaboration reached other professors. Some whispered that Henrik had lost his sense of order. Others said Hans had become arrogant. One afternoon, Professor Lind walked into the lab unexpectedly. The air went still. "Professor Lind." Henrik greeted him politely. Lind's expression was cold. "I hear you're planning to reform the way physics is taught," he said, his tone sharp. "We're exploring ideas," Henrik replied calmly. Lind turned his gaze toward Hans. "And you? Do you believe you know better than centuries of established teaching?" Hans straightened but spoke respectfully. "No, sir. I just believe there might be more than one way to learn." "More than one way?" Lind said, raising an eyebrow. "Knowledge does not bend to opinion. Physics is precise. There is a right way and a wrong way." Henrik's voice was gentle but firm, and yet every great discovery began with someone who asked if there might be another way. Lind's eyes narrowed. "Be careful, both of you. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing when it forgets discipline." He turned and left without another word. The door closed softly behind him, but his warning hung heavy in the air. Hans sat in silence for a while. "Do you think he's right, sir?" Henrik smiled faintly. "Partly. Curiosity does need discipline. But discipline without curiosity is nothing but silence." Hans thought about that for a long time. He realized both men were right in their own way. Lind represented order, Henrik represented freedom. Maybe true learning lived somewhere between them. When the day of the lecture finally came, the main hall was filled with students and professors. The dean sat in the front row, his hands folded calmly. Hans could feel his heart thumping in his chest as he stood behind the curtain, holding the notes he had written the night before. His palms were sweating. Henrik placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't try to impress them," he said. "Just speak the truth." Hans nodded and stepped onto the stage. The crowd quieted. He took a deep breath and began. "When I was asked a question during my physics exam," he said, his voice steady at first, "I didn't give the answer that was expected. I gave the one that made sense to me. Some people laughed. Some were angry. But I learned something that day. That science isn't about remembering what someone told you. It's about seeing things for yourself." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some looked skeptical. Others leaned forward, listening. He continued, "When we stop asking questions, we stop growing. Every formula in a textbook began as a question someone once dared to ask. Newton wondered why an apple fell. Galileo wondered why objects moved. If they had only memorized what others told them, we'd still be in the dark." A soft murmur went through the audience. Hans felt his nerves fading, replaced by quiet confidence. He held up a small barometer that Henrik had given him earlier. "This," he said, "is just a tool. But in the hands of someone curious, it can be more than that. It can be a doorway to understanding. I used it to measure a building's height, but what I really measured was how far a question can travel." For a moment, there was silence. Then, to his surprise, applause began, slowly at first, then growing louder. Even some professors stood, nodding thoughtfully. Henrik smiled from the front row, proud and silent. When the applause faded, the dean stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Hans," he said warmly. "Today you reminded us what education truly means." After the lecture, people gathered around Hans, asking him questions, sharing ideas. Even some who had doubted him earlier seemed changed. But Professor Lind wasn't among them. He had left quietly halfway through, his face unreadable. Later that evening, Hans and Henrik walked home together. The sky was clear for once, stars shining brightly over the city. "You did well," Henrik said. Hans smiled. "I just told the truth." Henrik looked up at the stars. "That's all science ever is. The truth spoken by those brave enough to see it differently." As they reached the corner where their paths split, Henrik stopped. "Remember, Hans," he said softly, "today was only the beginning. The hardest part isn't proving your point, it's keeping your belief when the world pushes back." Hans nodded slowly. "I understand." When he walked home that night, his heart felt lighter, yet his mind carried a quiet weight. Change had begun, but he knew it wouldn't come easily. There would be more resistance, more doubt. But deep inside, he also knew something else, something powerful. Once an idea takes root in people's minds, no rule can stop it from growing, and his one simple answer had already begun to grow, quietly, steadily, changing everything in its path. The days after the lecture felt different. Something had shifted in the air around the university. Students walked through the halls with more energy, more questions. They debated ideas in courtyards and stayed longer in classrooms after lectures ended. It was as if someone had quietly opened a window and fresh air was finally flowing through the old walls. Hans noticed it everywhere he went. One morning, while walking across the courtyard, he overheard a group of students arguing about gravity. "But what if it's not a force pulling us down?" one said. "What if it's space itself bending?" Hans smiled quietly to himself. That kind of question, the kind that reached beyond the expected, was exactly what he had always wanted to hear. But while the students were inspired, not everyone felt the same. Some professors whispered that things were getting too loose. Others claimed the university was losing discipline, that curiosity was turning into chaos. At faculty meetings, debates grew heated. Henrik defended the new approach, insisting that curiosity wasn't chaos, it was progress. But Professor Lind and his supporters disagreed. They said structure kept science strong, and without it, truth would crumble into confusion. Hans found himself caught in the middle. He never wanted to start a battle between teachers. All he wanted was for learning to feel alive again. But now it seemed he had become a symbol, something people either admired or blamed. One chilly evening, Henrik called Hans to his office. The lamps flickered softly as he poured 2 cups of tea. "I think we're reaching a turning point," he said quietly. Hans took the warm cup, his fingers trembling slightly. "A turning point?" Henrik nodded. "Yes. The dean has called for a special council meeting next week. The question of how we teach physics will be on the table. It's no longer about an exam or a single answer. It's about the future of education here." Hans's eyes widened. "They're really going to decide that?" "Yes," Henrik said. "And they'll expect me to defend our side. But I want you to come with me." "Me?" Hans asked, shocked. "You're the reason this began," Henrik said softly. "You deserve to be there. And I think your voice might reach them in a way mine can't." Hans didn't answer immediately. The idea terrified him. Facing the council meant standing before the most powerful minds in the university, men who had spent their lives guarding tradition. But deep down he knew he couldn't walk away now. "I'll go," he said finally. The night before the meeting, Hans couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his small room, watching the street below. The lamps outside flickered, and a cold wind pressed against the glass. He thought about everything that had happened, the exam, the laughter, the arguments, the lecture. How strange it was that one simple question about a barometer had brought him to this point. He took the barometer from his desk and turned it in his hands. It had become more than an instrument now. It was a reminder that truth wasn't always in the formula, but in the courage to see things differently. The next morning, the council chamber was filled. The dean sat at the head of the long oak table, and the professors lined both sides. The air felt heavy, thick with expectation. Hans stood near the door beside Henrik, his heart pounding so hard he could almost hear it. Professor Lind was already there, his face calm but cold. He looked at Henrik and Hans with a polite nod that didn't quite hide his disapproval. The dean began, his voice steady. We are here to discuss whether the teaching methods of the physics department should be revised. Professor Henrik has proposed encouraging open reasoning and alternative problem solving. Professor Lind has raised concerns about maintaining academic discipline. He paused. Both sides will be heard. Henrik spoke first. His voice was calm, his words thoughtful. He talked about how curiosity was the foundation of discovery, how every major scientific advancement came from someone who dared to think beyond what was written. Then it was Lind's turn. Discipline, he said firmly, is not the enemy of knowledge. It is its backbone. Without it, we risk replacing science with speculation. We teach structure because structure ensures truth. A student who defies the question risks defying the truth itself. The room was silent when he finished. The dean nodded. Thank you, Professor Lind. Now I believe Mr. Hans has something to say. Hans froze for a second. He hadn't expected to be called so soon. Henrik gave him a gentle nod. Hans stood, his palms damp, and stepped forward. Every eye in the room turned toward him. He took a slow breath and began. I never meant to challenge anyone, he said softly. When I gave my answer during the exam, I wasn't trying to be clever. I just saw a simple way to solve the problem. I didn't think it would cause so much trouble. A faint smile moved through the room, but Hans continued. But I've learned something since that day. I've learned that physics isn't only about formulas. It's about understanding the world. Sometimes understanding comes from following rules. Sometimes it comes from breaking them to see what's beyond. He looked at Lind. I respect the rules, sir. They keep us grounded. But if we never question them, how can we move forward? For a long moment, the room was silent. Even Lind didn't speak. Then the dean asked quietly, And what do you believe teaching should be, Mr. Hans? Hans hesitated, then answered from his heart. I think teaching should be like lighting a fire, not filling a bucket. It should make students curious enough to explore on their own, not afraid of being wrong. His voice grew steadier as he spoke. When I gave that answer with the barometer, it wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about showing that there's always another way to look at a problem. That's what science is about, wonder. And if we stop wondering, we stop discovering. The dean nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Lind. Professor Lind? Lind sighed, his hands folded neatly on the table. I may not agree with his methods, he said, but I cannot deny his reasoning. Perhaps there is room for both order and curiosity. A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the room. Henrik smiled faintly. The meeting ended not with a decision, but with a promise. To review how students were being taught, to allow more open-ended thinking in the curriculum. It was a small step, but a real one. Outside, the sky had turned pale blue. Hans and Henrik walked out together into the crisp air. For the first time in weeks, Hans felt calm. You did well, Henrik said quietly. I just told the truth, Hans replied. Henrik nodded. That's all it ever takes to change the world, someone willing to tell the truth. In the following months, small changes began appearing across the university. Teachers started adding new kinds of questions to exams, ones that encouraged creative thinking. Students were allowed to propose their own experiments. Even Lind, though still strict, began occasionally asking his classes, Can anyone think of another way? Hans became a quiet inspiration to many. Younger students often approached him after lectures, asking how to think differently, how to find their own answers. He never lectured them. He simply smiled and said, Don't be afraid to be curious. But despite all the attention, Hans stayed humble. He still studied late at night, still walked the same cobblestone streets, still stopped to stare at the stars as if they were questions waiting to be answered. One evening, as he and Henrik sat in the lab watching the sunset, Henrik said, Do you realize what you've done, Hans? Hans shook his head. I didn't do anything, sir. I just answered a question. Henrik smiled. Exactly. And sometimes that's all it takes, a single honest answer to make people think differently. You didn't just change a classroom. You changed minds. The room grew quiet. The last light of the day glowed through the window, casting a warm golden hue over the instruments on the table. The old barometer caught the light, its glass shining softly. Henrik looked at it and said, "Strange, isn't it? That such a small thing could measure not just air pressure, but courage." Hans laughed quietly. "Maybe one day they'll use it to measure curiosity too." Henrik smiled, his eyes thoughtful. "If that day comes, I hope they'll call it the Hans scale." They both laughed. But beneath the laughter there was something deeper. A shared understanding that what had happened would outlive them both. Because real change doesn't shout. It whispers. It starts with one person brave enough to ask why, and it spreads quietly, softly, until the world starts asking too. And that's exactly what was happening now. Years passed, but people still remembered that day in the council room, the day a young student stood up and made everyone think differently. What started as a small debate about a single exam question had quietly grown into something much larger. Change never happens in one loud moment. It begins softly, almost invisibly, like the first rays of sunlight that slip through a dark window before dawn. At the university, things began to shift in small ways at first. New professors came in with fresh ideas, inspired by the quiet courage of one student who had dared to see things differently. Old lessons were rewritten, experiments redesigned, and discussions encouraged. The word why became welcome again. Hans stayed at the university for several more years, first as a researcher and later as an assistant to Professor Henrik. The two worked side by side, often late into the night surrounded by glass tubes, brass instruments, and chalk-dusted blackboards covered in scribbles. Their conversations were not just about physics. They were about the way people learn, think, and grow. One night, as snow fell silently outside, Henrik looked up from his papers and said, "You know, Hans, I used to think teaching was about passing on knowledge. Now I realize it's about lighting curiosity. Once a student begins to wonder, no wall can hold them back." Hans smiled faintly. "It's strange how everything started with one question." Henrik nodded. "Questions are powerful things. They can unsettle, inspire, even frighten people, but they move us forward." As the years went by, Hans's reputation spread quietly beyond the university walls. His unconventional answer, the barometer answer, became a story shared among students around the world. Some said it was a tale about creativity. Others said it was about rebellion. But to Hans, it was always about honesty. The honesty of seeing something simple and refusing to pretend it was more complicated just to please others. Eventually, newspapers picked up the story. "The student who outsmarted his professor," one headline read. "A question that shook the classroom," said another. Hans laughed when he read them. The world, it seemed, loved drama. But the truth, he thought, was far gentler. There was no victory or defeat, just learning. One day he received a letter from a small college in another country. The letter was written by a young teacher who had read about his story. The teacher wrote, "Your answer reminded me why I became a teacher. I stopped asking my students to repeat what I told them. Now I ask them what they think. The results are unbelievable." Hans held that letter for a long time. It felt like a message from the future, a sign that what had begun in one small classroom had started to reach far beyond what he could see. Years later, when Professor Henrik passed away, the university held a small memorial in his honor. People from all over came to speak about his kindness and brilliance. When it was Hans's turn to speak, he stood quietly for a moment before saying, "He taught me that true teaching is not about being right. It's about helping others find their own right answers." After the ceremony, Hans walked alone to the physics building. The halls felt familiar yet different, filled with younger faces and newer voices. He walked into one of the old classrooms and smiled. The chalkboard still smelled faintly of dust. A group of students were gathered around a table, arguing happily over an experiment. None of them noticed him standing there. He didn't interrupt. He just watched for a while, the laughter, the curiosity, the energy. It was exactly what he had hoped for all those years ago. When he finally left, he placed something small on the teacher's desk. It was the same old barometer, the one that had once started it all. The glass was a little scratched now. The brass edges dulled with time, but it still gleamed softly under the light. On a folded piece of paper beside it, he wrote just a few words, "For those who still dare to ask why." That night, Hans walked through the quiet streets of Copenhagen. The city lights shimmered in puddles from the earlier rain. He stopped on a bridge and looked down at the reflection of the stars on the dark water. The same stars he had stared at years ago when he was just a nervous student, unsure if his strange answer had been a mistake. He smiled. Life, he thought, was not about knowing everything. It was about the courage to keep asking. Over time, his story spread far and wide. In schools and universities, professors began using his example to teach something deeper than physics. They used it to show students that knowledge was not a prison, but a doorway. That real science was not about memorizing what was already known, but daring to explore what was not. Textbooks began to change too. New sections appeared, encouraging students to find creative ways to solve problems, to think outside the formulas. Across Europe and later the world, the quiet ripple from that one barometer answer turned into a wave of new thinking. Years later, a new generation of scientists would credit that same shift for inspiring them to see the world differently. One of them, while giving a lecture on quantum mechanics, mentioned Hans's story and said, "It was not just an answer, it was a spark. Without sparks like that, science would still be standing still." Hans never sought fame. He never claimed to be a hero. He continued his quiet work, teaching and experimenting, always curious, always humble. Sometimes his students would ask him if the story about the barometer was true. He would smile and say, "It depends which part you believe." He didn't like to talk about it much, not because he was embarrassed, but because he didn't want the story to be about him. He wanted it to be about what it meant, that ideas, no matter how small, could change the way people think forever. In his later years, Hans lived a peaceful life. His home was filled with books, notes, and small inventions. He spent long afternoons sitting by the window, watching children walk home from school, laughing and carrying their bags filled with books. He hoped their teachers were asking them good questions, the kind that made them think deeply, not just memorize answers. One evening, a young journalist visited him. She wanted to write an article about his life. "Sir," she asked, "do you think your answer really changed the way physics was taught?" Hans smiled. "No," he said softly. "I think people changed it. My answer was just a reminder of what they already knew in their hearts, that learning should be about discovery, not fear." The journalist nodded, touched by his words. "And if you could tell students one thing today, what would it be?" Hans looked out the window at the fading sunset. "I'd tell them not to be afraid of being different," he said. "Sometimes the world will tell you you're wrong just because you see things your own way. But if your heart tells you it's true, keep going. The future always belongs to those who keep asking questions." After the journalist left, Hans sat quietly for a while. He took the barometer, now back in his hands once again, and placed it on the windowsill. The last light of the day glowed through the glass, scattering golden reflections across the room. He closed his eyes and smiled. He didn't need applause or fame or monuments. Knowing that he had made people think was enough. The next morning, a group of students found the old professor's room empty, but peaceful. On his desk lay a piece of paper with one final note, written in his careful handwriting. "Knowledge grows when curiosity is free. Let it breathe." That single line would later be framed and hung in the hallway of the physics building, right above where the barometer once stood. Every new student who walked past it would pause and read it, some not knowing who had written it, others whispering the story as legend. And that's how it all lived on, not in books or awards, but in the quiet spark that lit 1,000 new minds, a single answer, a single question, and the courage to think differently. That was how one student changed, the way physics was taught forever. Many years had passed since Hans's time. The city around the old university had changed. Electric trams now rattled through the streets where horse carts once rolled. The air was filled with the quiet hum of modern life. New buildings had risen, but among them, the old physics department still stood, its tall stone walls and arched windows a reminder of another time. Inside, a young historian named Clara was sorting through dusty boxes in the university archives. It was a gray afternoon and soft rain tapped against the glass panes. She had been assigned to catalog old documents for an upcoming exhibition celebrating the school's 200th anniversary. Most of the boxes were filled with routine records, exam papers, attendance logs, laboratory notes. But then in one corner of the room she found a small wooden crate sealed with a wax emblem that had faded with age. Curious, she carefully pried it open. Inside were a few books, some old photographs, and a round brass instrument wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, her breath caught for a moment. It was an old barometer. The glass was slightly fogged and the metal was tarnished, but the engraving at the base was still visible. She leaned closer and read the words carved faintly into the brass. For those who still dare to ask why. She froze. Something about that line felt different, personal, almost alive. She took out a small notebook from the crate, its pages yellowed and fragile. Inside, the handwriting was careful and steady. The first page read, "Notes on Curiosity and the Measure of Thought." It was signed simply. H.O. Clara frowned slightly, trying to recall the name. She had read so many records about famous scientists and professors from the university's history. Some names she remembered well. But these initials didn't ring a bell. She kept reading. The notes weren't about formulas or measurements. They were reflections, thoughts about learning, about how questions matter more than answers, about how science should never lose its sense of wonder. One page caught her attention. A student's mind should never be a mirror of his teacher's. It should be a window to a wider sky. Clara smiled softly as she read the line. It was simple, poetic, and true. She felt something warm stir inside her, the kind of feeling that comes when you know you've stumbled upon something meaningful. Later that evening, she brought the barometer and the notebook to the curator of the museum. The older man adjusted his glasses and examined the items with deep curiosity. "Where did you find these?" he asked. "In the archives," Clara replied. "I think they belong to someone named Hans Olsen, or at least that's what the initials suggest." The curator's eyes widened slightly. "Hans Olsen," he repeated slowly. "There's an old story about him. A student who gave a strange answer during an exam long ago. Some said his answer changed how physics was taught." Clara leaned forward. "What kind of answer?" The curator smiled faintly. "They say a professor asked him to measure the height of a building using a barometer, and instead of using air pressure, the student said he'd tie a string to it and lower it down." Clara's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant." "Yes," the curator said, chuckling softly. "Brilliant and a little rebellious. But it made people question what real learning was. For years, his story was passed down quietly among teachers, but eventually, like many stories, it faded." Clara looked down at the barometer in her hands. Maybe it's time to bring it back. Over the next few weeks, she dedicated herself to piecing together Hans's life. She dug through old letters, student records, and faculty meeting notes. Slowly, she reconstructed the story. How a young man's honest answer had sparked debate. How a professor had defended him. How their simple act of courage had quietly reshaped the way people thought about education. The more she read, the more she felt connected to him, not as a figure from the past, but as a person. Someone who had once sat in a cold examination room, nervous but determined to stay true to what he believed. Someone who hadn't tried to be extraordinary, but became extraordinary simply by being sincere. One evening, Clara sat alone in the museum's small restoration room, staring at the barometer on her desk. Its glass reflected the dim light of the lamp beside her. She wondered what Hans might think if he could see the world now. Students using computers, rockets flying beyond the sky, science exploring mysteries even he couldn't have imagined. And yet, she thought, his message still mattered, maybe now more than ever. The night before the exhibition, Clara finished writing the description card that would sit beside the barometer. It read, "This instrument belonged to Hans Olsen, a student at the University of Copenhagen in the late 19th century. His unconventional answer to a simple question challenged the way science was taught and inspired generations of educators to value creativity and curiosity over memorization." When the exhibition opened, visitors streamed in. Students, teachers, and even scientists from across the country came to see the displays. Among them was an elderly physics professor named Johann. He had spent his life teaching, but often felt disheartened by how mechanical learning had become. As he stood before the glass case holding the barometer, he read the engraved words slowly. "For those who still dare to ask why." He felt something stir deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. That spark of curiosity, that quiet joy of wondering. He smiled, remembering the students who used to challenge his lessons, the ones who asked too many questions. He realized those were the students who had truly learned something. When Clara approached and asked if he liked the exhibit, Johann nodded. It's beautiful, he said. This student, Hans, he reminds me why I started teaching in the first place. Clara smiled. That's exactly what I hoped people would feel. Later that evening, after the crowd had gone, she walked through the now empty hall. The lights were dim, the echo of footsteps faint. She stopped in front of the barometer one last time. She imagined Hans standing there beside her, not as a ghost, but as a memory woven into the air. She pictured him smiling quietly, the way someone does when they see that the world has finally understood what they meant all along. The rain outside had stopped, and the city lights shimmered on the wet streets. For a moment, everything felt timeless, the past and present overlapping like reflections on glass.